Berlin, 1987. A punk band nobody remembers pressed 200 vinyl records that East German intelligence tried to burn before the wall fell. What they didn't know, those grooves contained something far more dangerous than three-chord rebellion. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a retired Stasi officer still checks his mail for unmarked packages, and why collectors who own these records refuse to play them past the third track. Before we dive into the rabbit hole, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because this channel uncovers the tech mysteries they don't want you investigating. We're talking about stories that blur the line between Cold War espionage and analog hacking. The band called themselves phosphorescence. Their sound, imagine if Einstürzen Neubauten had a baby with early Kraftwerk, then abandoned it in a Stasi listening post. They played exactly 7 shows in East Berlin basements between March and October 1987. No posters survived, no set lists. One witness, a philosophy student named Klaus Veitch, later told a Dutch journalist that the loop contained what he called auditory braille, a term that makes 0 sense until you learn that Veitchinger went on to work for Siemens' experimental cryptography division, Esco Spielavang. But 3 people who attended those shows independently reported the same thing. During the 4th song, the lead singer would stop mid and the guitarist would play a 17-second loop that sounded like a modem having a seizure. The second curiosity. East German bootleggers had access to Western pressing plants through a network of Yugoslav intermediaries. The phosphorescence used a facility in Bitterfeld that specialized in industrial training records for factory equipment calibration. Why would a punk band choose a plant that pressed instructional vinyl for lathe operators? The third detail is where things fracture into speculation territory. A pressing plant technician named Rolf Messner disappeared in November 1987. His apartment was cleared out. His mother received a postcard from Prague 3 months later, with a single sentence. The waveform remembers what we forget. Let's rewind to January 1987. The Soviet Union is 2 years away from collapse, but nobody knows it yet. East Germany's Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, is at peak paranoia. They're microfilming everything, recruiting informants at a rate of 1 per every 63 citizens. But there's a problem festering in Department 8, the division responsible for observation and reconnaissance. A mid-level officer named Werner Kestner has been noticing patterns in Western radio transmissions that don't match known NATO encryption protocols. He writes a memo suggesting that Western intelligence might be embedding secondary data channels in commercial broadcasts, specifically in music. The memo gets laughed out of the room. Kastner gets reassigned to monitoring postal workers, but he keeps a copy of that memo, and 6 months later, someone breaks into his apartment and steals only that document. Nothing else. Not his watch, not his wife's jewelry. Just a 9-page technical memo about hypothetical steganography and audio. Now, here's where phosphorescence enters the frame. The band's bassist, a guy who went by the stage name Oscar Nell, worked as a sound engineer for Radio DDR2 during the day. His job was to maintain tape decks and calibrate broadcast equipment. Boring, right? Except Oscar had a hobby. He collected obsolete recording formats. He owned a wire recorder from 1948, a dictaphone belt machine, and a piece of equipment that shouldn't have existed in East Germany. Nagrafores, reel-to-reel, used by Western intelligence agencies for field recordings. How did Oscar acquire a Nagra in a country where you needed 6 forms of approval to buy a Western typewriter? Nobody knows. But what we do know is that Oscar started hanging around the Bitterfeld pressing plant in early 1987, weeks before Die. Phosphorescence recorded their only album. He told the plant manager he was researching acoustic phenomena for a radio DDR documentary that was never broadcast, never scheduled, and left no paper trail. The album got pressed in late September. 200 copies, black labels with white text. No artwork. The title was printed in a sans serif font you'd see on electrical hazard signs. Spectrum Null. The tracklist was equally cryptic. Side A had 4 songs with timestamps instead of titles. 4:17, las 3:52, las 6:33, 2:41. Side B had 3, 11:09, las 5:20, and the final track listed only as a Cyrillic character that doesn't correspond to any standard alphabet. Music historians have tried to translate it. The closest approximation is a glyph used in pre-reform Russian orthography to denote a dropped hard sign, a letter that exists only to modify the sound of what comes before it. Linguists call this a phantom phoneme. Cryptographers call it a null marker. So what did spectrum null actually sound like? The handful of people who've heard it describe a wall of distorted guitar feedback, drum machines locked into irregular polyrhythms, and vocals processed through a ring modulator. Standard punk chaos. But embedded in that chaos were sounds that didn't belong. Tones that sat just outside the range of comfortable hearing. A sub-bass pulse at 19 hertz, right at the threshold where sound becomes a physical sensation rather than something you hear. And those 17-second loops, the ones Klaus Vici-Ringer called auditory braille, appeared in every track. Always at different times, never repeating. If you mapped the loops across the entire album, they formed a sequence that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds, which happens to be the average time it took an SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missile to travel from launch site to NATO airspace. Coincidence? Let's keep going. By October 83, copies of Spectrum Null had been distributed. 40 went to record shops in East Berlin. 23 were handed out at Die Phosphorescence's final show, a chaotic set in a Prenzlauer Berg squat that ended when someone called the Volkspolizei. The remaining copies unaccounted for. Students, punks, the usual suspects, but one buyer stood out. An older man, maybe 50, wearing a suit. He bought 3 copies, paid in West German marks, and left before anyone could ask his name. A week later, Werner Kessner, the disgraced Stasi officer who'd written a memo about audio steganography, was found dead in his apartment. Official cause: heart attack. Maro la Maro. But here's the thing. Within 2 weeks, Stasi officers started showing up at every location that sold the album. They didn't confiscate the records. They didn't arrest anyone. They just asked the same question. Who bought this? Shop owners gave descriptions. Young, male, mostly. Few women. Unofficial whispers. His body was discovered with a record player still spinning, the needle stuck in the run-out groove of a Spectrum null pressing. Now we hit the inflection point, November 1987. Mikhail Gorbachev is pushing glasnost. The Cold War is thawing, but the intelligence apparatus is still ice-cold paranoid. NATO conducts a military exercise called Certain Shield, simulating a response to a Soviet first strike. The exercise includes a protocol called perimeter override, a theoretical bypass for launch authentication that would allow field commanders to authorize nuclear retaliation without waiting for chain of command. Confirmation, it's a doomsday failsafe, and it's classified at levels so high that even most generals don't know the details. But someone knows, and someone decides to hide those details in the last place anyone would look. A punk album pressed in a forgotten factory in East Germany. Here's the technical speculation. Vinyl records are analog, which means the audio signal is a continuous waveform carved into the groove. Standard music occupies frequencies between 20 Hz and 20 kHz, but the groove can hold information outside that range. Subsonic frequencies, ultrasonic frequencies. If you had the right equipment, you could encode digital data as phase shifts. In the waveform, variations so subtle they'd be inaudible, but recoverable with the correct decoding algorithm. Think of it as frequency hopping, spread spectrum, a technique used in military communications to prevent jamming. Only instead of hopping across radio frequencies, you're hopping across the audible spectrum. A song that sounds like punk noise to human ears could simultaneously carry a digital payload to a machine that knows what to listen for. And if you wanted to make that payload even more secure, you'd split it across multiple tracks, requiring someone to play the entire album in sequence to reassemble the data, which is exactly how Spectra Null is structured. Now, let's talk about the man in the suit. In 2003, a former KGB archivist named Yevgeny Primakov published a memoir that mentioned a West German intelligence operation called Tontrager, which translates to sound carrier. According to Primakov, Tontrager was a joint CIA-BND effort to exfiltrate nuclear launch protocols from Soviet-aligned states using consumer media. The operation allegedly recruited engineers with access to pressing plants, broadcasting equipment, and recording studios. The goal was to create what intelligence analysts call a dead drop in plain sight, a method of transferring classified information by hiding it in objects so mundane that no one would think to look. Primakov's memoir was pulled from circulation after 3 weeks. The publisher claimed a copyright dispute. Copies that survive now sell for thousands of dollars in online auctions, and every single page that mentions Tontrager has been redacted with black marker so thick you can feel it through the paper. But here's where the quarter-differential threads start braiding. Oscar Null, the bassist with the Nagra recorder, vanished in December 1987. Same month as Ralph Mesner, the pressing plant technician. Same month that a fire destroyed the Bitterfeld facility, erasing all records of what had been pressed there. East German authorities called it an electrical fault. Insurance investigators noted the presence of and Klaus Sube, Ringer, the philosophy student who described the auditory braille, left East Germany in 1988 with a research visa to study cognitive acoustics in West Berlin. He never returned. His thesis, titled Isomorphic Encoding in Nonverbal Signal Structures, was submitted to the Free University in 1991, but remains classified under German federal archival law. When a journalist filed a Freedom of Information request in 2009, the response was a single-sentence denial. The document pertains to matters of ongoing national security interest. Let's examine the technical anatomy of the alleged code. Launch codes for Cold War-era nuclear systems followed strict formatting. They were typically 8 to 12 alphanumeric characters, refreshed on a rotating schedule to prevent compromise. But the actual code was only half the puzzle. You also needed authentication protocols, the sequence of steps to verify that the person entering the code had the authority to do so. This is where things get diabolically clever. If you wanted to hide a launch code in an audio file, you wouldn't encode the code itself too easy to extract if someone suspected what they were looking for. Instead, you'd encode the authentication protocol, the logic tree that tells you how to use the code. It's the difference between giving someone a key and giving them instructions on how to pick the lock. One is useless without context. The other is a blueprint for chaos. So how would you extract this information from a vinyl record? You'd need 3 things. First, a turntable with a modified cartridge capable of picking up frequencies outside the normal audible range. Second, an analog-to-digital converter with a sampling rate high enough to capture ultrasonic data. Third, a decoding algorithm that knows how to map phase shifts back into binary data. In 1987, that kind of equipment wasn't sitting in every basement, but it was standard issue in signals intelligence units. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces had mobile labs for analyzing captured communications, the kind of lab that could easily be disguised as a radio broadcast van, the kind of van that was spotted parked outside the Bitterfeld plant the week before Spectrum Null was pressed. Fast forward to 1989. The Berlin Wall falls. East Germany collapses. The Stasi archives get seized, and researchers start combing through millions of documents. But there is a gap. Files from Department 8, the Observation and Reconnaissance Division, are incomplete. Entire months are missing from 1987. When archivists asked surviving Stasi officers about the gaps, they got evasive answers. Some claimed the files were destroyed during the transition to avoid compromising sources. Others hinted that certain operations were so sensitive they were never documented in the first place. But one officer, speaking anonymously to a German investigative journalist in 1997, said something chilling. Some things were recorded in formats we couldn't read. We knew they existed, but we didn't have the machine to play them back. By the mid-1990s, Spectrum Null had become an urban legend in underground music circles. Collectors whispered about the album in IRC chat rooms and early web forums. A few claimed to own copies. None could produce verifiable proof. Then, in 2001, a vinyl dealer in Prague listed a Spectrum Null pressing on eBay. The auction description was sparse. Original 1987, East German pressing. Unplayed condition, no damage. The starting bid was set at €50. Within 12 hours, the bidding hit 10,000. The auction was abruptly cancelled. The seller's account was deleted. But screenshots of the listing survived, and audio engineers started analyzing the low-resolution photos. They noticed something odd. The run-out groove. The smooth spiral at the end of the record, where the needle should just spin silently, had visible markings. not scratches. Intentional etchings. Microscopic characters that looked like a mix of Latin script and mathematical notation. In 2008. A German audio preservation society attempted to track down surviving copies of Spectrum Null for a digitization project. They contacted record stores, private collectors, and former East German cultural institutions. Out of the original 200 copies, they located exactly 4. 2 were in unplayable condition. Grooves worn smooth from repeated plays. The third was owned by a collector in Leipzig who agreed to let them digitize it under strict conditions. No spectral analysis, no forensic examination, just a straight audio transfer. When they asked why, he said, "I don't want to know what's in there." The 4th copy was in the possession of a retired BND officer who refused to speak on the record. Off the record, he told the researchers that the album had been flagged in an internal database as a potential vector for data exfiltration, but the investigation had been closed without explanation in 1992. So what do we actually know? We know the phosphorescence existed. We know they pressed an album at a factory that later burned down. We know Stasi offices investigated the album's distribution. We know people connected to the album disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. We know Western intelligence had active operations to smuggle classified information using consumer media. And we know that the technical capability to encode digital data in analog audio existed in 1987. What we don't know is whether anyone actually did it. Whether Spectrum Null was a punk album, a covert intelligence operation, or both. Whether those 17-second loops carried launch codes, noise, or just the sonic fingerprint of a band that wanted to sound dangerous. Now, let's get speculative. If you were going to design a system to hide nuclear launch authentication protocols in a vinyl record, you'd build in redundancy. You wouldn't put all the data on one copy. You'd split it across multiple pressings, each carrying a fragment. A collector with one record has noise. A collector with all 200 has the full payload. But you'd also need a key, a way to know which records to combine and in what order. That's where the Cyrillic glyph on side B comes in. It's not a title. It's an index marker. A sorting function. If you had the right decoder, that single character would tell you which position this specific pressing occupies in the sequence. It's like a page number in a book, except the book is scattered across 200 vinyl records, and only someone with the complete set can read the full text. There's another layer. Vinyl records degrade. Every time you play them, the needle wears down the groove. After 100 plays, the fidelity drops. High frequencies disappear first, then mid-range detail. Eventually, you're left with a muffled ghost of the original, but subsonic and ultrasonic data that degrades differently. Phase information can survive long after the audible music is turned to mush, which means a Spectrum Null record that sounds unplayable to human ears might still carry a recoverable digital signal. It's a self-destructing message that doesn't actually it just hides in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right tools to come looking. In 2012, a data forensics researcher named Petra Schilling published a paper on steganographic capacity in analog media. She demonstrated that vinyl records pressed in the 1980 South could theoretically carry up to 2.7 megabytes of hidden data per side if the encoding exploited phase modulation and frequency layering. For context, a typical nuclear launch authentication protocol from that era would require less than 1 kilobyte. You could fit the entire protocol suite for a missile brigade on a single track and still have room for a punk song. Schilling's paper included a footnote that mentioned spectrum null as a potential case study, but the reference was vague, almost dismissive. When contacted for this video, Schilling declined to comment, citing ongoing research. Her university's press office said she's currently on sabbatical. Her last known location is a library in Zurich that specializes in Cold War intelligence archives. Here's the thing about Cold War secrets. They don't expire. Treaties get signed, borders change, governments collapse, but the infrastructure of secrecy persists. Classification levels that were supposed to last 25 years get extended to 50, then indefinitely. Documents that should be public domain remain locked in vaults because someone, somewhere, decided that the information is still sensitive. And sometimes, the reason it's still sensitive isn't because of what it reveals about the past, but because of what it could enable in the present. A launch authentication protocol from 1987 might seem obsolete in an era of digital encryption and satellite verification, but the logic behind it, the human factors, the psychological fail-safes, the backup protocols for when everything else fails, those principles don't change. They get refined, updated, repackaged, but the core architecture remains. And if that architecture is documented somewhere, hidden in a format nobody thinks to look at, it becomes a vulnerability. So, why vinyl? Why not microfiche, or a floppy disk, or a coded message in a newspaper? Because vinyl is cultural. It's art. It moves across borders. Without suspicion, people collect it, trade it, play it at parties. A floppy disk in 1987 screams data. A punk album screams rebellion. One gets inspected at checkpoints. The other gets waved through. And once it's in circulation, it replicates organically. Someone hears it, likes it, makes a tape dub for a friend. The tape gets copied again. The music spreads like a virus. And if there's a hidden payload embedded in that music, it spreads to. It's the perfect vector for information smuggling. The Keezy carrier doesn't even know they're smuggling anything. But let's consider the counter-argument. Maybe spectrum null is exactly what it appears to be. A weird punk album that attracted attention because of its timing and the paranoia of the era. Maybe Werner Kestner died of a heart attack. Maybe the Bitterfeld fire was just an electrical fault. Maybe Oskar Nall and Rolf Messner left East Germany because they wanted to escape, not because they were silenced. Maybe the Stasi investigated the album because they investigated everything, not because there was anything to find. Maybe the 17-second loops are just experimental noise, the kind of thing punk bands did to sound of up. Maybe the Cyrillic glyph is a pretentious artistic choice. Maybe the whole thing is a constellation of coincidences that people have connected into a conspiracy because the narrative is more interesting than the mundane truth, except for one detail. In 2019, a spectrum null pressing surfaced in an estate sale in Hamburg. The buyer, an audio engineer named Lukas Brenner, decided to run a full spectral analysis out of curiosity. He uploaded the results to a private audio restoration forum. The waveform showed anomalies in the 18 to 22 kHz range, patterns that didn't match known audio artifacts or pressing defects. When Brenner tried to isolate the anomalies, his software crashed. He rebooted, tried again, same result. A third attempt triggered a kernel panic that wiped his analysis tools. Brenner posted about the experience on the forum, asking if anyone else had encountered similar issues. The thread was deleted within hours. Brenner's account was banned. When he tried to contact the forum administrators, his emails bounced. The domain had been taken offline. So airy. We are. Spectrum null exists in fragments. A handful of surviving pressings, degraded memories from people who heard it, classified documents that mention it in passing, and a lot of questions with no satisfying answers. If the album really did contain nuclear launch codes, who put them there? Was it a rogue Stasi officer trying to sell secrets? A Western intelligence operation trying to exfiltrate data? A third party using both sides as cover? And if the codes are real, are they still valid? Or have they been rotated out, rendered obsolete by updated systems? Or is the whole thing a red herring? A deliberate distraction planted to waste resources while the real operation happens somewhere else? They think about mysteries like this. Is they're designed to resist resolution. Every answer spawns 3 new questions. Every document you find has 3 more references you can't access. Every witness you track down has a story that contradicts the last one. It's a labyrinth with no center, just branching paths that lead deeper into uncertainty. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real secret isn't what was hidden in the grooves, but the fact that people are still looking, still speculating, still trying to decode something that might not even be a code. If you made it this far, you're clearly someone who doesn't accept easy answers. So here's the challenge. If you had access to a spectrum null pressing and the right equipment, how would you extract the hidden data if it exists? What kind of cartridge would you use? What sampling rate? What decoding algorithm? Drop your theories in the comments. And if you've got connections to Cold War audio archives, intelligence history, or experimental cryptography, subscribe, because we're just getting started. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And I've got a feeling we're still only seeing the surface.